Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. I'm really glad you're joining us today for this deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating piece of science communication. It's a critical analysis of Carl Sagan's 1977 classic book, The Dragons of Eden.
Yes, and our mission today is to explore this text not just as a piece of history, but as a lens through which we can examine how science is shared with the public
Right.
and what it actually tells us about the architecture of the human mind.
Exactly. And the reason this specific analysis matters so much is that it isn't simply a standard book review. We are looking at a truly foundational moment in popular science. This deep dive is about how we understand human intelligence itself, the methods we use to communicate highly complex scientific theories to a general audience, and perhaps most importantly, how our deep evolutionary past constantly clashes with our rapidly advancing technological future.
That tension is exactly what we need to unpack. Because when you think about it, what happens when you combine space-age technology with the brain of a reptile?
It sounds like a premise for a science fiction movie.
It does, but that is the exact biological reality Sagan was trying to explain to the public.
It's a profound question. And to really appreciate it, we first have to look at what people usually think about human intelligence. There's a very common, comforting assumption out there that the human mind is a perfectly rational, logical machine.
Right.
We tend to believe that our intellect is the ultimate executive in charge of our actions. We make a plan, and our brain executes it.
We like to think we're in total control.
Exactly. And furthermore, we often assume that science communication is merely the delivery of dry, objective facts, completely separate from emotion, philosophy, or storytelling.
Right. We think of scientists simply handing down data from a whiteboard. But the analysis of this book shows that neither of those assumptions holds up. Sagan was writing this book in the late 1970s. He was a prominent astronomer, but this was just before his massive fame with the television series Cosmos.
So picture the historical moment for a second. Coming out of World War II and deep into the Cold War, you have the absolute height of space exploration, you have the pervasive, quiet terror of nuclear war, and you have these brand new cognitive sciences emerging.
All of these forces collided in Sagan's writing.
That historical context is crucial. Sagan saw a cultural appetite for big picture stories. People were looking up at the stars, but they also wanted to know what humans actually are and where our intelligence is taking us.
So he took a highly speculative leap. The explicit premise of The Dragons of Eden is an exploration of the evolution of human intelligence. He traces how our brains emerged from reptilian and mammalian ancestors, and he asks what that deep biological history implies for our survival as a species in a nuclear age.
Okay, so to explain this evolutionary history, Sagan brings up this biological concept called the triune brain. What exactly is that? Because it sounds wild. Are there literally 3 brains functioning inside our heads?
It's more like an archaeological dig inside your skull.
An archaeological dig.
Yeah. The triune brain model suggests that our brains are layered products of evolutionary time. At the very bottom, right at the brainstem, you have the reptilian complex.
Okay.
According to this model, that layer governs basic survival, aggression, and territorial instincts.
So that's the oldest part.
Exactly. Then on top of that, you have the limbic system, which we inherited from early mammals.
Right.
That part processes emotions, social behaviors, and nurturing.
Right.
And finally, wrapped around all of that, you have the neocortex. That is the newest layer, the part responsible for logic, language, and abstract thought.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about daily life. Think about the last time you experienced severe road rage.
Oh, absolutely.
Your neocortex, the logical part, knows you are just sitting in a metal box in traffic and getting angry won't make the cars move. But your reptilian brain feels perfectly justified in panicking because it thinks your territory is under attack. It really feels like 2 different minds fighting for the steering wheel.
That is a perfect analogy, and it gets right to the deeper context of that model. These older and newer forms of behavior don't just sit passively on top of one another like geological rock layers.
They interact.
They coexist, and they frequently clash. What Sagan is really arguing is that human beings are internally plural. We are not just one unified rational mind. Reason, emotion, and primitive drives are all in constant tension within us. We are actively negotiating between the impulse of a prehistoric predator and the reasoning of a modern scientist.
All within the exact same brain.
Exactly.
That internal plurality is such a vivid way to understand ourselves, and it leads directly to the way the book is structured. The analysis points out that Sagan's writing is very associative and poetic. It oscillates wildly in its emotional resonance.
That really does.
On one hand, you read it and feel this profound cosmic wonder at the vast evolutionary timescale that produced the neocortex. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there is a very real, quiet alarm running through the chapters. Sagan was deeply worried about the danger of carrying those ancient reptilian aggressions into an era where we possess nuclear weapons.
He recognized that he needed a way to make that abstract danger feel urgent and real to the everyday reader. And to do that, he turned to myth. He uses ancient stories to explain biology.
The title itself, The Dragons of Eden, is a prime example of this, right?
Yes, exactly. The dragons represent our ancestral fears, the ancient reptilian predators embedded in our deep evolutionary memory. And Eden represents the idea that knowledge is both a remarkable blessing and a catastrophic fall from innocence.
Using a myth like Eden to explain neurobiology is a huge creative leap for a scientist. He also brings in Plato's analogy of the charioteer. Imagine your neocortex as a charioteer desperately struggling to control two unruly horses, representing the emotional limbic system and the primitive reptilian brain. It makes the complex neuroscience instantly relatable to anyone who has ever tried to break a bad habit.
It does. It's brilliant communication. But this brings us to a significant risk that the analysis highlights. While these metaphors make complex science intuitive, they risk something called narrative determinism.
Narrative determinism, what does that mean in practice?
Narrative determinism is the trap of taking highly complex modern social phenomena, things like warfare, economics, or political polarization, and too easily tracing them back to a few symbolic ancestral motives.
Ah, I see.
It's incredibly tempting to say we fight wars simply because our reptile brains are acting up. But human conflict involves modern institutions, complex sociology, resource allocation, and historical grievances. We have to be careful not to let a beautiful metaphor overwrite the complex reality of human behavior.
So if these metaphors are so beautiful and relatable, where does the problem start? Because it sounds like you're saying mapping a literal dragon to our brainstem might be a bit of a stretch anatomically.
Exactly. And that naturally brings us to a deep critique of the book. The analysis is very clear about where Sagan's argument shines and where it strains under the weight of its own ambition.
Let's start with where it shines because he brings some heavy evidence to the table. The book is incredibly strong when Sagan relies on comparative data, when he looks at the tangible differences in brain structures across species, or when he breaks down neuron counts. The hard evidence is rock solid. But the part I found most fascinating was his inclusion of research on chimpanzees.
Yes, the chimpanzee research is a crucial pillar of his argument. He brings in fascinating data about primates using sign language and symbol systems. He specifically looks at cases like Washoe, a chimpanzee who learned American Sign Language and could communicate her needs, her emotions, and even create novel word combinations. Sagan uses this to show how close our evolutionary cousins are to us in abstract thought. By demonstrating that language and conceptual thinking aren't exclusively human, he grounds his vast evolutionary speculation in observable, modern biology.
That comparative data definitely makes his theories feel more concrete. But obviously, any book attempting to explain the entire history of human intelligence is going to have some flaws.
Right.
If we are modeling careful, fair questioning today, what are the logical strains in his argument?
The analysis explicitly names 3 distinct logical fallacies present in the Dragons of Eden. Let's look at fallacy number 1, the argument from analogy.
Okay.
We just touched on his use of metaphor, but the strain occurs when Sagan leans too heavily on those metaphors as scientific proof. For instance, he maps the layers of the triune brain directly onto Sigmund Freud's psychological theories of the id, the ego, and the superego. He also maps them onto Plato's chariot.
Right. He's taking philosophical concepts and trying to locate them physically in the brain.
Exactly. The logical lead happens when overlapping metaphors are mistakenly treated as actual anatomical evidence for deep structures in the mind. A metaphor can brilliantly illustrate a truth, but it isn't biological data. Just because the idea of a chaotic hyaid sounds like a territorial reptile brain does not mean they are the exact same neurobiological mechanism.
The map is not the territory.
Exactly.
That makes total sense. What is the second logical strain the analysis points out?
Fallacy number 2 is the omission of evidence, or smoothing over disputes. The analysis notes that Sagan deliberately underplays live, highly heated debates that were happening in psychology at the time he was writing.
Really?
Yes. During the 1970s, the field was heavily fractured. There were massive controversies regarding behavioral conditioning, cognitive psychology, and individual differences. But Sagan smoothed over all of that.
Why would a rigorous scientist do that? Why leave out the messy data?
The reason is quite revealing about his ultimate goals. He wanted to avoid unsettling implications that might challenge cherished human beliefs about our own autonomy and our fundamental equality.
I see.
He wanted to present a unified naturalistic psychology to the public. If he admitted how fractured and uncertain the behavioral sciences really were at that moment, it would have undermined the sweeping, unifying narrative he was trying to build.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
He prioritized the narrative cohesion over the messy reality of the scientific consensus. And that leads to the third fallacy, doesn't it?
Yes. Fallacy number 3 is technological solutionism. This is the assumption that more intelligence, whether it is biological evolution or artificial intelligence, will naturally express itself as wisdom.
Intelligence equals wisdom.
Exactly. Sagan held of a very deep, almost romantic optimism that as our neocortex develops or as we become more technologically advanced, we will naturally become more peaceful, cooperative, and ethically grounded.
But history doesn't really support that, does it? The flaw in that reasoning seems pretty significant. Greater intelligence or superior technology absolutely does not automatically equal greater moral wisdom.
Not at all.
In fact, couldn't more intelligence simply magnify existing injustices? It just gives bad actors more powerful, efficient tools to enforce power imbalances.
That's a vital critique. Intelligence is a tool. It doesn't inherently contain a moral compass. And this brings up a larger issue the analysis calls the ethos problem.
The ethos problem.
Right. Because Carl Sagan was so authoritative, so articulate, and so genuinely morally concerned about human survival, readers trusted him implicitly. Because he sounded like the definitive voice of science, readers treated highly contested ideas, like the strict anatomical division of the triune brain, as completely settled science.
That raises a massive ethical question about the responsibility of science communicators. When you have that much authority and reach, your simplifications, your metaphors, and your omissions become the public's accepted facts. People walk away thinking they have a literal reptile living in their brainstem because Carl Sagan said so.
It is a found responsibility, and it connects directly to the civic implications of his work. Because despite those logical strains and the ethos problem, Sagan's core ethical move in the book is actually quite beautiful, and it's highly relevant to how we think about living well together. He presents a deeply egalitarian vision of humanity.
How does evolutionary brain biology lead to egalitarianism?
His argument is that if intelligence is an evolutionary gift forged over millions of years of struggle, then all humans share a common ancestry and a common potential. We all possess this incredible neocortex, and we all struggle with the same limbic and reptilian drives.
We're all in the same boat.
Exactly. Therefore, our politics should not be based on tribal supremacy, but on our mutual vulnerability. We are all just trying to survive the modern world with these layered, conflicted brains.
I really appreciate that perspective. It levels the playing field for everyone, and it completely explains his intense belief in the power of education. Sagan was a lifelong champion of democratizing scientific literacy.
It was.
He firmly believed that citizens, not just a small group of elites or scientists, need to understand science so they can control the technological forces that shape their lives.
Yep.
If you understand how your brain works and how the universe works, you cannot be as easily manipulated by fear or political rhetoric.
That is the ideal outcome of his work. But to maintain a fair analysis, we must impartially note the limitations the text brings forward. By deliberately avoiding the darkest, most controversial aspects of behavioral science, Sagan created a blind spot regarding justice.
The blind spot.
Yes, because he wanted to present a unifying, uplifting story about human potential, he failed to fully confront how scientific findings have been historically misused.
Misused in what way?
Well, the analysis points out his avoidance of the deeply flawed and culturally biased IQ debates that were raging during his era. By smoothing over how science has sometimes been weaponized in racist or elitist ways to justify inequality, he leaves the hardest, most uncomfortable questions about justice and power completely unresolved in the book. He gives us the tools to understand our biology, but he sidesteps the painful history of how biology has been used against marginalized groups.
So when we synthesize all of this, the brilliant metaphors, the logical fallacies, the egalitarian hopes, and the blind spots, what does this mean for us today? The analysis draws a direct line from Sagan's speculative tour in 1977 right to our modern challenges. The ultimate lesson here seems to be about designing the future.
Precisely. If we want to build a humane future, we have to design our institutions, our technologies, and our education systems for the creatures we actually are. We are not pure logical agents. We are simultaneously imaginative, fearful, hierarchical, empathic, and capable of vast abstract thought. Any economic or political system that assumes humans will act perfectly rationally is destined to fail, because it completely ignores the reptile and the mammal that still live within us.
It changes how you look at everything from designing a social media algorithm to passing legislation. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, how should you debate this book, or really any piece of popular science, fairly with others?
The best framework for debating this text should center on science communication itself. You have to weigh the benefits against the risks. You can ask, does the massive benefit of inspiring cosmic wonder, promoting scientific literacy, and crafting a unified human narrative outweigh the risks of oversimplifying complex neuroanatomy and avoiding uncomfortable truths about human nature?
It's a trade-off.
It is. That is the balance every public intellectual, educator, and science communicator has to strike.
It is such a tightrope walk. You want to inspire people, but you have to remain scientifically rigorous. Well, thank you for joining us on this Mindful Moments deep dive. We have covered a lot of ground today, looking at both the breathtaking ambition and the structural flaws of Sagan's project. We explored the triune brain, the power and danger of mythic metaphors, the logical strains of technological solutionism, and the ethical responsibility of communicating science to the masses.
And to close out our discussion, we want to leave you with 3 open questions to carry into your classrooms, your reading, or your own personal discussions.
Go for it.
First, when you look at modern conflicts, do you see them as a clash of our ancient and modern brain layers, or is that metaphor too simple to explain complex human behavior? Second, does Sagan's technological solutionism, the hope that more intelligence naturally leads to wisdom, hold up when we look at today's debates around artificial intelligence? And third, how do we want today's science communicators to balance clarity, humility, and ethical depth when human dignity is at stake?
Those are fantastic questions to sit with. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. If Sagan was right that our brain is an archaeological record of our evolutionary past, a stack of reptile, mammal, and primate operating systems, what happens when we start interfacing our brains directly with computers? Will advanced technologies become the 4th layer of the brain? And if they do, who is going to be holding the reins of the chariot? Thank you for nourishing your mind with us today, and keep asking the big questions.